So now we're back for our second roundtable, which concerns transparency in public policies. And we'll be starting at 3 o'clock. Before we start, I'd like to hand over to our speakers. Let's answer a question via the link that's going to be appearing in the chat. All of the results will be displayed directly on the screen. Thank you very much for attending, everyone, and I wish you all a very enjoyable roundtable. So for the first question, don't hesitate to answer this first question that you can see on the screen. So a warm welcome to all of you to this policy conference. We're now attending the second roundtable, which is called Can Design Be a Guarantee of Transparency for the Democratic Process for Citizens? Now, before we start, I'd invite you to answer two questions via the link, which is going to be coming up in the chat. So thank you very much for attending, everyone, and I'd like to wish you all an excellent roundtable. So the first question up on the screen, what did you need in terms of transparency during the lockdown period? And was there a response from institutions? Or did institutions fulfill your needs? So let's move on to the next question. I'd like to invite you to answer the second question, which is going to be coming up on your screen. We'll be starting the roundtable at 3 o'clock. And before we start, as an icebreaker, I'd like to ask you this second question. So the transparency of public actions, are they a guarantee of democracy? And then one last call if you'd like to answer the questions. Good afternoon and welcome to all of you who have just arrived and have joined us at this policy conference. We're here today for the second roundtable, which concerns the democratic process and transparency of public action. Is it a democratic guarantee? We'll be starting at 3 o'clock, and so if you'd like to answer the question that is going to be coming up on your screens, there is a link. And the question follows the title of this roundtable. The idea is to see whether we can have a guarantee of the democratic process if we have the transparency of public actions. So enjoy the roundtable, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be starting the policy conference. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And so it's more comfortable for everyone. I'm going to change the way in which we view the conference so that you can see the speaker. At the top right of your screen, you'll be able to see a small emblem which will enable you to change the way in which you're displayed. So either you can be active as a miniature, or you can actually be shown as the speaker. So enjoy the conference, everyone, and I'm going to hand over now to our moderator for this afternoon, Luther Quenum.
Merci, Chloé.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be spending 2 hours together where we're going to be talking about transparency of public actions and whether it's a guarantee of democracy. I'm a designer and I work at the European Metropolis of Lille, where I'm in charge of a laboratory for public policy. Maybe we can go around the table and I can introduce the different speakers that we have with us today. I think we can start maybe with Geoffrey Dorne. Good afternoon. Geoffrey, could you introduce yourself? Yes, of course. My name's Geoffrey Dorne. I am a freelance digital and print designer. I've been doing that for 16 years. I've deal with all sorts of different projects, so with images. I teach, I lecture, I am in design and human and environmental design. I'm interested in refugees, young people who are in trouble, and I try and become involved in all of these types of issues, and I use my design skills for these different causes and missions, which are of public and social interest. Thank you very much. Now we have Yoan Ollivier. Hello, everyone. My name is Yoan Ollivier. I'm the co-founder of an agency called Vraiment Vraiment, which is involved in design. So we use design so that we can help local authorities so that they can design and improve public services. Wonderful. And then finally, we have Frédérick Lemarchand. Yes, good afternoon. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Caen, Normandy, and I focus mainly on the relationship between technoscience, society, and the understanding of risks and vulnerabilities and social questions. So we're going to be spending 2 hours together so that we can talk about this subject, which is a vast subject, so much to say about it. To start with, maybe we can have a look at the way in which this session is going to be organized. First of all, we'll start by discussing the terminology, and we'll try and understand what we actually mean and link it into what we're experiencing at the moment with this health crisis so that we can really think of some concrete themes and the things that we would like to touch upon. In terms of the transparency of public action, I don't know whether I've really understood what it means. So do we imagine that transparency is a real virtue, that it could be compared with secrets and opacity, which are almost criminal? Geoffrey, maybe you could start by telling us what you think. So for you, is transparency a virtue, or is it something that it's systematically positive? Now, that's a very good question. Thank you very much for asking that. I would tend to say that there isn't just one form of transparency. There's not just one transparency, in the sense that, for example, when we talk about software tools that are open, you can read the code, it's transparent, and you can therefore understand the code, the text, and anything that you can display. If you go onto the data.gouv.fr website, you've got access to a lot of content and tables, so that's access to transparency, but you've got to know how to understand it, interpret it. I can't read transparent code. Sometimes it's too abstract for me. I can't interpret Excel spreadsheets that the government puts on its data platform either, because sometimes there are things that go beyond what I could comprehend. And so what does transparency mean? And then, do I want my life to be transparent to the public? Not necessarily. I have a private life. Everybody has a private life. And so I think that we've got to try and come to an agreement on the definition of transparency and see how we can adapt it depending on the different subject or situation. Here we're talking about the transparency of public action, which is a different subject again. So how can public action be transparent? And if it can, is it a way in which it can be accountable and give an account of what is happening so that each citizen can then analyze it? Or should it be accompanied with a form of teaching so that it can be understood in order to be transparent? So that's one of the points that I think that is important to look into. There's not just one form of transparency, and also it's good to make things transparent, but how can we do it, and how far shall we go, and for whom are we doing it? Okay. Frédérick, do you have anything else that you'd like to say? Do you have the same opinion as Geoffrey? Talking about transparency isn't very easy to do, because transparency is one of those words that we lose all over the place, like resilience and even democracy today, because they don't really mean anything anymore. We use them so much, and I've never been very comfortable with this form of concept either, or this aesthetic translation of politics. I've worked a lot on the access to data, and I'll come back to that later on, especially with regards to GMOs, and I spoke to Corinne Lepage and some friends with whom I created an association whereby we could make information available when it's linked to pesticides and GMOs. Now, as far as the work that I'm doing at the moment in terms of secrecy, I have had to consider that sometimes it's not always good or a virtue to produce secrets because it's essential to people's privacy as well as politics. And as I said in previous discussions, it's almost a fantasy for totalitarianism because the idea is to make everything accessible to the people who control that information. And so in the exercise that we're doing, because we're in a category whereby we're looking at transparency and what would let light come through. And so the idea is what is invisible, what should be observed. And from there, it's almost like a game of complex mirrors where we say, is it the state that's looking at the citizen? Is it the citizen that's looking at public affairs, state affairs, etc.? And so the word transparency is a word that we're going to come back to. But I don't think it's easy to adapt to the type of question that we're going to ask if we're talking about democracy. And so that would be my first observation, maybe. I think it's a word that we have to be very careful with in the way in which we use it. We can discuss it, and that's the aim today, to start with the idea of transparency so that we can have access to other questions which are more fundamental. But I think that it's a word which is maybe not suited to the question that we would like to look at when we're talking about democracy. And so what type of word should we use then? Instead of transparency, I prefer to talk about access to information, maybe making things public, because the borderline between public affairs and private affairs is slightly, it's not clear for the moment, maybe, for citizens. And to put your data on the internet, even intimate or private data, is a question which, sociologically speaking, is essential in a period which is slightly contradictory, because we absolutely want to protect people's private lives, and we want to make sure that there are complex forms of complex legislation so that we can protect people's private lives. So now even sociologists can't have access to data because people's private lives are so protected, but at the same time, millions and millions of people show their private lives on the internet using all sorts of cards, like their banker's card, or their social security card, etc. Coded access can actually trace people's private lives and the way in which they're living in a far more effective way than any form of policing could do. And the police use these means as well today so that they can organize surveillance and even control people's private lives. And so that's, I think, part of the question that we have got to try and come back to today and try and look into, because it's a paradox, a societal paradox, because there's this desire on the one hand to exist, so you go beyond yourself, you exhibit what you do in a public arena in a new way. In the old days we used to go down into the street and we used to demonstrate in an agora. Now it's the social networks, social media, which enable us to expose what's going on in our private lives, and it enables us sometimes to even create a shared life. So it's quite a complex situation, but at the same time we have never before tried to protect our private lives so much. And so I'd maybe like us to talk about that as well, to have a look at that paradox and to try and see exactly what we can do with it. Okay, so that means that we're going to be quite busy for the next 2 hours. Yoan, have you got anything that you would like to add to that? It's maybe a question of the way in which we use it. Now, as a designer, we're going to ask ourselves how some of these policies are used for the public, and the question of transparency is a question of use. How we're going to use that transparency, and we can therefore deal with it from different angles, from different viewpoints. So from a public action point of view, can we be transparent? Do we have the knowledge in-house so that we can be transparent with information? And do we have the real knowledge of how we can use the data and process it? So that's a question we could ask ourselves when the questions of data aren't maybe as developed as we think they are. There's another question with regards to power, because in France there are lots of forms of protection sometimes the data exists, but it's not accessible to territorial authorities because either they don't have the means to capture that data or because legally they're not authorized to do so. And so it's very important to be very cautious with regards to who can use that data. And so you can't compare anything with everything because there are all sorts of legal boundaries as well. And then once you've asked the question with regards to can you do it and how can you do it, you've got to say whether you want to do it. And that's a fundamental question with regards to public action, because as a public agent, as a civil servant, civil servants are servants of the state, and their aim is to follow the directives that are given to them. And so things aren't going to happen in the same way as in the general public. And so it's not like with entrepreneurs or with businessmen where in terms of civil servants, they have to think about the general public and the interests of the general public. Sometimes you can see that civil servants really want to be open. They'd like to be more open, but they try and create tools which are open, and there are lots of different digital practices that people are using, which are very interesting because it enables us to explain things better to the general public. But the challenge is going to be how we can use all of this, because and should we make all of this data public? Is transparency a duty, and is it a duty that we should give to politicians, and is it something that should be a duty for civil servants as well? Because transparency can be found at different levels of hierarchy in terms of the use, and all of that is very important. Now, from what we've just heard, you can see that there's a link between transparency, power, and control. And it's true that in the subject that we're dealing with today, we can see the relationship between transparency and democracy. From what you were saying, Frédérick, it would also appear that there is quite a clear line between transparency and totalitarianism. Frédérick? Yes, and it's the same with democracy, and that's why the question is so difficult, because when you start with a word like transparency, I was talking about the question of totalitarianism because today, in technological questions, there are so many issues that we have seen in the past. If we think of the Soviet system, I spent 20 or 25 years of my life thinking about the consequences of Chernobyl, and I worked a lot on that situation, and there are new forms of power that enables us to control other people. Gilles Deleuze talks about the society of control. We're no longer just talking about surveillance, but it's the person who manages flows that is the person in control. So if you think of capital, human beings, goods, and so the world is now more fluid, more liquid, as Bowman, the sociologist, would say, but that's the world we're living in. And so the way in which we control flows of all sorts has become capital. So for the powers that are already there, like the GAFA, the industrial powers, the states, which have made a great comeback with the way in which they're managing the COVID crisis, but then also of other forms of political power that are authentically democratic and that have come from civil society. We heard us talking about participative science, for example. That's what I'm interested in. And so we've got to take science from academic research and official pathways so that ordinary citizens in a neighborhood, in a town, can carry out a survey, become more involved, and understand their own beliefs, and maybe then afterwards try and implement a way of living together, building together, using knowledge, finding new forms of organizing where they live, developing the territory. And so the question that is raised straight away with regards to the transparency of public actions, so the possibility to have access to a certain amount of information, or that question is quite essential, I think, today, because you can see that there are various schemes and systems that have made public action quite murky. If you look at industries, there is a lot of protection as well. You could call it state secrets, industrial secrets. military secrets. And so that means that citizens are asking that people should be accountable with regards to activities that could be risk activities. I'm thinking about that because something new has appeared in society in 2000 when groups of citizens started to demand accountability. So it's a question of empowerment. So the people who have made decisions now or 10 or 20 or 30 years ago have got to explain to society what the consequences are, either medium or long term. And so I'm thinking about decisions that could be the fact that we've accepted pesticides in agriculture, GMOs, or decided to build suburbs or spatial development. So all of these things are done because there's an urgent situation, and so decisions are made in certain situations which could be explained at the time, but there are now problems felt today, and so all of those issues become public issues. And that's why the question of access to information is absolutely essential, because it's part of the way in which people are going to be able to really investigate about the way in which they're living, their conditions of living as well, so that they can build things together. Now, that doesn't just mean together in a group with a group of dissidents. It can be with a community, with a town, with elected members. I don't like the word, but I think we've got to talk about co-building, co-designing, doing things together, find a new way of working together for public action based on trust. And that's a word that I'd like to introduce right now, because I think it's the one that's going to enable us in a way to compare it. We can compare it to the concept of transparency, and I'll come back to that later on, because I also have another thing against transparency, but I'll talk about that in more detail later on. And I think that the challenges with regards to trust are essential in the way in which we're going to be able to envisage the relations that we have in the future between the public and the private sectors, so civil society and the state or local authorities. It's true that when you look at the question of trust, there are so many shared schemes available because people don't want to be too transparent. So, for example, as a citizen, have we got to be able to know what we are financing with the social security system? Do we need a form of traceability? And has society got to be able to be accountable for the way in which some schemes would enable us to fulfill a form of contract with society whereby we contribute without having a clear visibility about the way in which things work, but which enables us to make choices, ask questions with regards to specific forms of care? And so we say, okay, well, I financed work on that form of cancer. And I think in terms of transparency in public action, I think that there are schemes that already exist, like social security, like pensions, and they work because they're anonymous and because we work together as a group. Now, it's not fundamentally opaque, but it's a way of contributing as a collective group, and it enables us to have trust in what is going on. We have to be trustful in what is going on in these organizations. Now we can see that yet again, in terms of transparency, it's not very easy to understand, and we can't just say transparency equals virtue and secrecy equals something negative, especially if we're talking about medical secrecy, for example. And if we think about public actions, the question I'd like to ask you is, what can we say to citizens then? What should we say to citizens with regards to the right to information, and where should that start and where should it end? Because earlier on, Frédérick was talking about military secrets, state secrets, and should those two things be done away with completely because we think everything should be transparent? I'm finding it quite difficult to see where that boundary should be. In terms of the limit and the boundary, I think everybody saw the information in the press today with regards to Jacques Chirac, the French president's election campaign, where his accounts were concealed. And 25 years later, that opacity has become transparent, and we have now quite interesting revelations. But for me, that is just something that's in the news, and I would like to compare it to the Avia law that you've probably heard of as well, where the government is trying to censor content online or websites by saying if content can be considered hateful with all of the different types of flows that could involve, then we are going to censor the content. And when you put those two aspects together and compare them, when we think of transparency and democracy, on the one hand, we've got political personalities who use that opaqueness so that they can carry out anti-democratic actions, and then we've got other politicians who would use transparency so that they can then carry out anti-democratic actions against citizens. And I would invite you to go and look at David Dufresne's documentary, where he talks about all of the situations that occur in politics, and he compares them to a desire or pressure on citizens, because citizens have to be open, transparent with their data, their content, they have to put their name on social media, etc. But in comparison to that, is public policy the same? And so, however, people who are rich and have power, they can hide that information. And so I think that there's that lack of symmetry, which isn't just a question of transparency or opacity, but it's a question of democracy. It's a question of who holds the power and the strength. And as far as the public action is concerned, I think we've got to think about democracy and say, can we ask for more transparency from public actors, from governments, from people who make public decisions and political decisions, and guarantee that there is confidentiality and a private life which is being taken away from us by capitalism and surveillance in general, and I'll come back to that later on. And for me, I think it's that balance which is being lost. There had already been a lack of equilibrium, but I think it is disappearing little by little. And it's that balance which bothers me really. And I think that we've got to be able to suggest tools or offer tools so that we can find a better equilibrium. But it's not in the interest of the state to balance this, or in the interest of capitalistic businesses either, because it can only be to the favor of citizens rather than their favor. And with everything that citizens can produce, it can only be in that way that we could bring a balance. Now, I got the impression that Yoan wanted to say something. No, I was just thinking about that with the limits that you were talking. One of the limits that I think is important is the relationship with regards to those presidential campaign accounts. There's a problem with the availability of data and figures and availability of digital data in general. And one of the limits is the expertise that is required so that we can understand all of this information, because the accounts are available, but we've got to be able to investigate them, work on all of that information so that we can draw conclusions. And another systematic thing that's important is, what are we going to do in public life to make data available and usable? Because if we look at the data on the government website, there's a lot of data, there are a lot of figures which are very, very elaborate, difficult to use because they're not in a uniform format either, very difficult to compare and collate as well. And so it's hard to have a form of education for how we can use data so that afterwards we'll be able to sort it, understand it, and make use of it. And I agree with what Geoffrey was saying as well, because we're going through a period whereby we're asking a lot of democratic questions, and we've got to see where the democratic spaces are where we can educate people on the use of data today. So I think we've got a lot of questions to ask. Yes, and if you look at the Macron leaks, the WikiLeaks, all of the leaks that are coming out all over the place, and the thousands and thousands of lines of Excel spreadsheets that you can see online, then a lot of work has got to be done by journalists to try and understand this. I'm thinking about Disclose.ngo, which is an independent media group, and they're working on this. And quite recently, yesterday or the day before, they brought out information on milk lobbies like Lactalis, etc. And I think afterwards, for citizens, we've got to try and understand how we can understand, compare, and collate this data. People have started during COVID, during lockdown web, they started to retrieve documents and data from the government so that they could try and find a way of representing it, because that's important. How we can represent this data, display this data, because with the same quantity of data, you can say a lot of different things. And so there's this idea of, from a public point of view, how we can represent this data. All of that is a question of power as well. And so, Frédérick, maybe you'd like to add something? Yes, obviously that raises so many questions, because everything you've said reminds me of experiments that I have carried out, or experiences that I've had in terms of participative science and citizen science. And I'd like to come back to the question of pesticides and GMOs. I'd like to be quite brief, but I'd like to tell you what we've been going through over the last 20 years at the CRIGEN with my biologist colleagues. And there is also an effect of false transparency as well, because you can instrumentalize science, and that's something that we have already managed to prove. Major industrialists today, pharmaceutical companies, agri-food businesses, since the 1960s, since Philip Morris and the questions of tobacco in the USA, I have worked with all of the health agencies, and in Europe, the European Parliament is inundated with lobbyists, a bit like Bill Gates today, who has bought himself the World Health Organization. So there's the problem with all of these public agencies, which have got to be examined, I think, very closely. And so it's all of these agencies in which we place our trust, because when we put a drug on the market, or when we put a toxic substance on the market today, we are supposed to be protected by all of these agencies of experts with expertise, and the members of those agencies are going to use their skills, their knowledge for the good of public health. And so we're not going to ask each citizen, I'm thinking ahead, I'm thinking about the question I raised earlier on, because we're not going to ask each citizen to be an expert in everything. And this ideal of transparency, I now know that when I receive my water bill, for example, people talk to me about how the water's used, etc. And all of the authorities try and give me a form of explanation of what's happening with the money that I have spent. And so that's what we're talking about today. We talk about transparency, but when we're talking about sensitive data for pesticides and GMOs, in that case, we've got to work with companies, a bit like in the nuclear industry. We're talking about a lot of lies and a lot of hidden facts. And if we think about the Roundup, which is the biggest weed killer sold in the world, it's a formula of 50 different products and one molecule, which is called glyphosate, that we have debated about a lot in the press. But there are 50 other products with molecules that are called surfactants, and they are 1,000 times more toxic than the main molecule itself. And so this hasn't been examined by the agency, because when it's put to market, we only look at glyphosate and its impact. And so it's a huge scientific issue, and there are hundreds of thousands of millions of cancers, because agriculture uses these projects everywhere in the USA, in India, in Europe, and we then ingest all of these products which are dangerous for our health, which create cancers, have an impact on our endocrinological system. And science, which should fulfill us in terms of clarification and emancipation, if we think of the project only a few centuries ago of modern science, this is all instrumentalized now. And so it's an instrument of for producing knowledge which should enable us to make decisions, but at the same time, it is completely opaque. And so I'd like to draw your attention to this fact that we can produce a form of ways talking about transparency, but it can hide the real practices. But I think that you have to investigate the way in which practices are hidden because of challenges that raise or that are linked into questions of the market and government and power. And agriculture is the biggest market in the world. And because even if you are poor, you have to eat. It's a market which represents $4 billion per year. And so there are so many examples of this. And so the democratic question, as far as I'm concerned, concerns this power struggle between the organizations in power today, which are more and more powerful and more complex because they're public and private at the same time, and there's a form of consortium, which is quite strange. And then on the other hand, we've got society, or civil societies, that try and organize themselves as best they can so that they can preserve what they are. But we're living during a period which will confront these different forms of powers, which are strengthened by social media, as Geoffrey said earlier on. And the technological side strengthens the power of domination, and poor people are subjected to transparency. They have to give their information, their data. And then on the other hand, you've got the consortiums, and you've got forms of powerful organizations which are relatively impersonal. And when you try and attack that form of power, then we find ourselves faced with boards of directors which are in different countries with diluted responsibility, with umbrella companies in the Cayman Islands. And so we have to try and bring down those smoke screens, and everything is very opaque, and paradoxically we call it the glass ceiling. But in a way it really does hide the challenges and the power which is now across the planet.
Indeed, we've seen that the access to data is not necessarily a proof of transparency and democracy. We've heard that the question is how we have access to the data, for what use. So indeed, it's possible to hide things, either not giving access to the data or even giving access to a lot of data. It can be hidden due to the complexity of the data and the necessary skills to analyze it. So who can guarantee the access to information, that right to an access to information? Is it the designers? Geoffrey, you've told us about how to structure the data. Who can be the guarantee to that access? Who can be the guarantor? I don't think it's a job or a title. It's a set of jobs and perspectives. It's as much politicians as private people, citizens. Being the guarantee of the data has to do with ethics. Indeed, there is the transparency of algorithms. Today we create digital tools. They can be private or public, and we use them every day, hundreds or millions or billions of users. And who can guarantee the transparency? Who can guarantee the clarity of these algorithms that govern many of our decisions? Algorithms for high-frequency trading, or the displaying of data on social networks, algorithms that will make legal decisions possible. All those tools, I think we cannot entrust that responsibility to one single job. Tibras says that, the founder of IDEO, he says design is too important to be left in the hands of designers. I believe it's the same thing. The issue of transparency is too significant to be left in the hands of politicians or industrialists. So it has to be disseminated, to be split. And we've seen it when we had the cryptocurrencies with self-checking, peer-to-peer, or digital logbooks. I think all that can maybe inspire a system of checking or validation, peer-to-peer, to ensure the quality of an information that we would want to be transparent, or the truth of information. It can sound generalistic or a bit too global, but I would really be curious to know for everyone, for the people who are listening, for Frédérick, Luther, Yoan, for you, what's important as a citizen, what should be transparent and what is not yet transparent in your life as a citizen. Is it the salaries of our elected representatives? Is it the number of voters on a law that's accessible? Or is it the name of politicians? An artist has tried to create an internet site with the faces of policemen and their name underneath, to have the name for the face. What should become transparent? I think it's interesting to ask that question, and I would invite the people who listen to ask themselves the question as well. Frédérick, what I've heard is essential. Geoffrey has talked about algo trading, these algorithms. We've tried to limit the damage, but they exchange big amounts of money, and they allow, in the end, to operate value transfers from one territory to another. A trader today clicks on their mouse to transfer money from one country to another one. They can change the living conditions of people, and that calls for ethics. More than transparency, there is for algo trading. You know, I moderate a seminar on post-human artificial intelligence with students and so on, and we could not organize a memorandum of science, though maybe it would be necessary to slow down, but it's not feasible. I think we have to wonder about the ethics, the limit. What do we accept to do or not to do? What's human, what's not human, what's acceptable or not? That question has to be asked. And instead of talking about transparency, about the information and data in algo trading, couldn't we have the right being the last guarantee of democracy, as we did for NGOs? If we talk about that, it's because these plans have direct consequences on health as a common good, the health of mankind. And we had to wonder if we had to accept or make them mandatory. And we have a label in Europe that condemned their use in supermarkets, so that we hardly have any MGOs in our plates in Europe, and we could impose that to the industry, and it holds for the time being. So that proves that we can win, even if we're David against Goliath. Sometimes the weakest can hit the right place. But let me come back to that notion of ethics. Of course, in public politics, we need to be accountable to citizens, because the public domain is at the service of the operations of our society. It is an organization of people or communities and families. So the question is not there to know if the public is accountable for society, because either we believe that society is accountable to the state, and that was part of totalitarianism in the 20th century, or we consider that the public is at the service of communities, and elected representatives are not only at the service of, but they are accountable. And just like the Roman consul, they have to give way to the next person, to the successor. We've created some semi-professional bodies of elected representatives, and we've let that power be removed. And now the challenge is to have it again. And then the issue of ethics. We need to make public some data, and there is the right question asked by Geoffrey or Luther. acceding to data is very well, but what will we do with the data? If tomorrow I receive my data about territory contamination and I'm told that there is lead or mercury in my garden, as what was done in Chernobyl, what can I do with that concretely? The mother who received that kind of information, what will she do? She will wonder if she can have her kids play in the garden, if she can use her vegetables. What will be the consequences on the health? These questions are so complex that they allow to give transparency to data about the environment, about the health that are complex without changing the whole system. And that was the case with nuclear power. In the Cotentin, there is a factory, and we cannot prevent the factory from contaminating the soil. There are some substances that we cannot trap. The citizens of that region in the 90s, under the impulse of a survey, they asked questions to the community. Some information was made public about the territory contamination, but in the end, nobody did anything with the data because they cannot be used by citizens. And that was my earlier question. Will each of us have to study medicine, chemistry, epidemiology, nuclear physics, and so on to manage one's life? No, we won't. So at the end of the day, we have to re-establish some trust that has been lost between communities, states, citizens, to allow each of us to have a pretty normal and serene life. Because if every morning I have to tell myself, I'm responsible for my health, the health of my kids, I'm going to work as an entrepreneur, and I have to take in hand my responsibilities, what do we have in the end? We have a citizen responsible for their own failures and unhappiness. If I have a cancer, that's because in my responsibility, I have not respected the recommendations. I did not have healthy food. I had to eat organic, though I knew agriculture was bad for my health and so on. And that leads to a phenomenon analyzed by Alain Ehrenberg, a philosopher, that creates depression. And depression is there in the wealthiest societies of the planet. We have that double constraint where we have become responsible, in a way accountable for our lives. And that's unbearable. What Frédérick says is very exciting. Explaining that from a psychological mindset is interesting. That's also what we're told with environmental issues. Citizens, you are responsible for sorting your waste, eating organic food, not polluting, and so on. Okay, very well. That's something that we integrate. Many people do their best. But indeed, if their kids tomorrow are unhappy, it will be due to them because they won't have had the good behavior. They will have taken taken planes too often. That puts a lot of responsibility on citizens. It's interesting to have responsible citizens in the noble meaning, but up to where can we be responsible? And as we've said, I really believe in the work of independent journalists to work for that understanding of the world, recovering data, comparing data, highlighting data, as ovni.fr did a long time ago. And also, as a designer, we have the job to put in pictures, objects, interfaces, diagrams, a kind of set of data, to put the data in the hands of people or journalists, entrepreneurs, whatever. And let me give you an example without doing some advertising. Some years ago, I wondered as a citizen about how many people who vote for deputies. And we hear there were 6 MPs in the Assembly to vote for the lobby law, or so many MPs to vote for the retirement law, and so on. So sometimes we have numbers, 100 and so on. And I wondered how many MPs we had to vote for laws that involve us. And so I created a site, DATASS Assembly, EMBLI.fr, and I said, okay, let me fill in the number of people from 0 to 177 MPs, and according to the number of people present, I have the laws that have been voted by how many people. So I know the laws that have been voted for 50 or 500 people. So I did it for myself. And I had to code things to recover data from the government and so on. And then I shared the information. And as Frédérick has said, not all citizens can take 2 weeks to do that and to learn the skills to do that. So we need writers, we need journalists and other people to guide that awareness, the general knowledge about a topic, public or political one, and give it to citizens, but making sure that it's sincere, transparent, not biased, that it's based on real figures, and that's extremely complicated to have that kind of label and believe in what you see in the internet or on the media. I think that today that trust is broken. And when I have a diagram, be that from a French channel, any French TV channel, do I believe in that? Is it based on opinion polls? Is it based on data? I don't know if the people who are listening still have that trust in that presentation of the data by journalists or others. But I think it is difficult to tell people, just check by yourself. If you don't believe, take the necessary time to check the code, to check the files and so on. It's complicated, it takes a lot of time. So I don't know how we can get out of that difficulty. If you have ideas, Frédérick and Yoan, I would be excited to hear that. I'd like to come back to the opposability of the law, because our debate is mainly based on the access to data. We talk about transparency only from a technical point of view nearly, while we can't say that public action is based on many issues of visibility. I like the decisions from the town. If we go back to design and presentation, the public action from a legal point of view is still in the hands of the town hall. And have you seen somebody who stops to read the decisions from the town hall? It's nearly symbolic, and that's important. Then something else. There is an opposability issue that will be very important in the way the public action will react. For example, with Parcoursup, one of the big difficulties is how we can proceed when we have to oppose oneself to a decision made by an algorithm. You nearly have to go to the court, administrative court, and in terms of the conception of the algorithms, some decisions are made in the public authorities not to have too complex algorithms, simply to be able to understand how the decision was made and to be able to follow the process. So indeed, the law will be a good protection. Then, of course, there are many questions that are raised on the code and the law, how they have to get structured. But I think there will be something interesting here. The issue of transparency will be linked to very simple topics. Am I able, as a user of a public service, to know what time that public service is open? That will be linked to very simple questions. For example, am I able to recover my information? And from an individual point of view, in terms of use, there are other virtues of transparency that will be linked to the use. And they are simply models of citizenship. I think we have a big emergence of the citizen considered as an activist, and not always as many other things. We do not all fall in a logic of ongoing activism, because we are also inhabitants. citizens who can go to court. And there is a bigger diversity in terms of usage that will be linked to the way we explain public action, the way we can have tools that can be heard. A big part of the administrative vocabulary is not really transparent. If you fill in a tax statement, it's already complicated. Beyond the issues of algorithms, there is a possibility of the public action to make itself accessible. So there are plenty of issues linked to the law, and there is a distrust here. Most interviews that people do are restricted to understanding what and how much. And the rest is a big complexity where citizens have to understand the technical words. And as a designer, we can wonder about the accessibility of the administrative initiatives, administrative actions. So that issue of transparency, if I come back to what you have all said, transparency in itself is a general concept. It can have different meanings. And when we split it along the discussion, we reach different layers. You have the access to information that will add up to the handling of the data and the information added to a capacity of action. Yoan, you have told us about town hall decisions. That action, that concept of transparency, if we imagine it with different layers, can we expect the same transparency at all levels, the town, the department, the municipality, the region, the state? Is there a diversity of things that we can expect from all these levels, or can we expect the same transparency, the same access to information? Transparency is not even part of the specifications of service provision. If we start from that, nobody asks the civil servants to be transparent. There are always people who say we'll have to be transparent once there has been a crisis. And we've had the example of that. Politicians have decided to get an ethical vision, and the public action states the creation of a single action, while journalists explain that the French army has a register of people during the Algerian war. There is a kind of circumstance that tells us that we need a guarantee on these issues. Today, when we ask the question of transparency, there is a question of scale, of level. Transparency can be at different layers, service, municipality, department, region, and that will be completely different. In some regions, there is a big distance from the notion of citizen, and the technical level is then very high. This does not mean that they are accountable to the citizens. But we agree on that. Today, I think that it's not really present. We can imagine a site where we are transparent on the data. It's not done. When we talk about transparency, very often internally in a public authority, that means reporting. We ask for transparency to report on the agents. And maybe one day we'll have a dashboard that will be left on the desk of somebody, but very often they're not read. So the design of those tools has an interesting level. How can we have transparency and have civil servants to be transparent on their activity? That's already complicated. Many civil servants today even don't know about their own action. That leads to issues of scale that impact all layers of public action today.
Geoffrey, maybe, do you have anything you'd like to add? It's really interesting that question of how we can be transparent and how we can be accountable. Earlier on, we were talking about the CNIL and the banners that we have on the website so that the website can be transparent to users, where it says, I'm tracing you because I've got analytical cookies, Google Analytics, etc., all of those things. And the fact that we force organizations to be transparent raised the problem that initially they have tracing devices and software. And so on my website, I don't have a CNIL banner tracking warning because I don't have any cookies or any analytics on my website. So if we want to reduce this increase in transparency, and if we track people less, we wouldn't have to tell them because we're doing it less. And so it might seem a little bit simplistic, but I get the impression that if we had less of a need to retrieve more and more data, sometimes we retrieve it for very good reasons, but sometimes we're taking the data saying, oh, well, maybe one day I'll be able to use it, and maybe one day I'll be able to earn money with that. Then I think it would become far easier to explain the situation to the general public, and it would be easier for them to understand if there was so much less tracking, advertising, analytics, etc. That's just what I was saying to myself as I was thinking about the CNIL banner that warns us, for data protection and asks us whether we agree with cookies. Yes, and it brings me back to traceability when we think of the agri-food business with it was necessary to talk about traceability when it didn't exist anymore because you could no longer just go and find your cow in the field next door. And so there's almost a counter notion that has appeared. I had two more questions. One with regards to the relationship between transparency, power, and what transparency and when and for whom. And can we say that transparency as we would envisage it... Sorry, there's a background noise here at the moment. I don't know whether you can hear that. No? Now, could we say that the question of transparency, as we envisage it from a democratic point of view, could we replace the term transparency by the fact that we are accountable? Is it the form of terminology which would have more meaning and which corresponds better to what we're trying to explain today? Is it the fact that we're accountable which guarantees democracy, or is it the fact that we're accountable in public action that we can guarantee democracy? Frédérick? Well, it's complicated. If we come back to transparency, we've mentioned lots of different directions and lots of different meanings for the word. It's not even a meaning. We ask questions each time. I'd like to come back to what Geoffrey was saying earlier on because it interested me. He was saying that the technologies that we use today are creating black boxes. Now, this isn't new. There's a philosopher I like, Gilbert Simondon, who thought about this in the 50s, and he said that we're lacking the history of technologies. We've got to know how to use our machines. And since the beginning of IT, our machines have become more and more obscure and opaque, and that's the problem with code and algorithms today. So what's public, what isn't, and what can we say to our citizens as well? It's such a complex situation because on the one hand, we've got major institutions like health authorities that say we need big data, we need various data so that we can be effective, a bit like vaccines. If we don't have what we need, then it just won't work. And also applications. Earlier on, we were talking about connected telephones, and it's the whole society that will be involved and will be giving more and more data to big systems that are going to cover people's health needs from an algorithmic analysis. And there are even works of fiction today that imagine that we could design remedies for pandemics using algorithms to create vaccinations. So But from there, if I take an example of something I worked on a few days ago, I was working on a master theory on what we call Stop COVID, because we were talking about the coronavirus crisis. And Stop COVID was put into place because of the current crisis. It was a way of collecting data based on a problem, which is who has been in contact with whom in society. And that is a way of social control which has been never seen before. We had never imagined that it would be so easy to make a society so transparent, so who has seen whom, and even in public and private spaces. And as I said, I'm working on a thesis with regards to connected agriculture with a startup that's working on IoT and working on connected devices. And I'll come back to that later on, because to the opposite of what the GAFA are doing, the idea is to take data down to the territory and the users. It's a company called Dimenside Instruments, which is based in Caen, and it's taken the problem from the other way around. So rather than taking the big data and then bring it down, they're working on empowerment, so they are increasing the capabilities of local users who will share data that could be weather information, it could be territorial data, etc. But the Stop COVID application, my friend who leads this startup is an engineer from MIT, and he was very well trained. And he said, you know, something unique has happened and unexpected has happened during the implication or the implementation of this app. Apple and Google gave their code for the Bluetooth application, and they made the code public, and it can now be used by anyone who makes applications. And that's brand new. So it means that via the Stop COVID application, which is a complete fiasco, and President Macron admitted that recently, and I think it's going to be replaced by another application which has a similar type of name. But by the way, we took that code so that any manufacturer of data applications could use Bluetooth functions of any device. And so the idea is that it can use the few square meters that surround each individual or each person that carries a device, a smartphone, and that will then be put into a value. And I think we can measure the impact of this, the social impact and the consequences on our freedom, and the impact on our freedom, without talking about the type of use whereby you would bump into someone in a bus and the applications might match, and you can imagine all sorts of situations like that, which would be the complete opposite of what the public authorities had imagined. And so via this example of the Stop COVID app, a use which could be legitimate in an emergency situation because of the health crisis, and because we need to know the contacts between individuals within a society in a precise situation, because we've got to try and trace people and catch as much data as we can, capture as much data as we can. But we've opened Pandora's box. We've opened towards an opacity now, which has led to an unimaginable situation, because today we have got to try and find a way of controlling this. And I think that we're talking about transparency, we're talking about light, and I think we've got to try and shed some light on this and put a spotlight on the situation. And I'd like people in legislation to talk about what this means, because it doesn't mean anything if at one stage we won't be able to create limits, boundaries with regards to the way in which this is used. So it's the role of the CNIL in France, the organization that works on data protection and confidentiality, because I don't want to have to control and keep an eye on my personal data. I want to be protected by an organization that guarantees, another organization can guarantee healthy agriculture and food. I'd rather live in a society where I will be protected by institutions, because we are going to look after those institutions as citizens, but those organizations have got to work for us rather than us having to do this type of work permanently. Now, I'd just like to conclude with that, because the access to data, well, there is legislation, there's European law, which is progress for us, because it means that citizens can have access to industrial data if there is a risk with regards to public health. And in France, we have a CANAB, it's the Commission for Access to Administrative Documents, and very few citizens know that they have the right to access any administrative documents. All you have to do is contact the committee, or this commission, and that's what we did, so that we could have information with regards to Monsanto, and Greenpeace did exactly the same thing in Germany, and we obtained all of the studies carried out by Monsanto with regards to the rats that have been treated with their products. And so we have the right to access, and there is a huge arsenal of material, but we keep going around in circles about this question, you know, what are we doing in our society? Because transparency isn't everything. Democracy isn't access to data. Democracy is fundamentally a debate, a way of questioning. It's a bit like logos in science. There isn't just one truth. In democracy in Greece, we spoke about doxa, opinions. And in democracy, we mustn't confront expert opinions. We must confront different opinions, compare them, deliberate, discuss, debate, and then we decide on the direction we would like to head in. And that's what it means to move forward in democracy. We've got the empty space, the agora, where we discuss, debate. It takes time. And it's not just a question of putting a vote in a box somewhere. What it means is we should have access to information into the ballot box, because in our world it's complicated. We're living in a world that's very uncertain, and then after that discussion, we have to make our decisions together. And that the question of transparency has got to be put into perspective with regards to democracy, because otherwise it doesn't mean anything. Well, that's what we've been trying to do since the beginning of this discussion. And so the answers to this, the solutions on a global scale, we know that we have a problem with powers which have gone beyond us, but at a local level, if we think of designers, we had a fantastic day in Caen recently with creative cities on a territorial scale, and I'm sure that there's so much to do at that level, a ground level, in a multidisciplinary way. We can bring researchers, designers, elected members, people from local authorities, citizens, who can all work together in a democratic way and in real democracy. And in terms of access to data, I think that that can be embodied by real practices. So shared data shared by inhabitants, as I said earlier on, because we can imagine IT systems, networks of data which are not connected to the GAFA, but would enable an authority to have a dashboard, which would enable it to understand the complexity of the challenges and not just have an indicator. If you take health, if you take the indicators, then there will always be someone who says, yes, but for health, we've got an answer. We can try and give somebody a scan so we can identify a cancer. For agriculture, we will then have a form of phytosanitary explanation. But if we put all of the data together with dashboards, which is what we've done in La Manche, in the north of France a few years ago, then we can share data, and it will enable us to shed some light on information, which will then enable people in local democracy to make the right decisions. Now, earlier on, you were talking about trust and the fact that we can't, as citizens, spend our time checking, looking at what's being done, and that we had to trust institutions, organizations to who were going to delegate the power. Now, Geoffrey mentioned earlier on, I think, the Edouard Balladure's presidential accounts and his campaign accounts and what we call the Conseil des Sages. So there's a council in France which provides expertise and controls or audits these campaign accounts, and they were hiding the truth. And so what can you do about that? Is there a solution to that if we can't trust the main organizations? Because obviously we can trust in these organizations, but they can cheat on us afterwards. So how can we actually guarantee that there we're not going to be betrayed afterwards? And we had a dead end. That's an extremely difficult question. I don't think any of us have an answer to that. No, neither do I. And, I think that here we're in a democracy, as Frédérick said. And the fact that we can offer or have discussion, debates, and if we can have a perpetual discussion about this in a democracy, then I think we can work towards trust. It's not the case 100% of the time, but I think it's the direction that we have got to aim for. But for the moment, it's not possible. It's not possible to have a body that can guarantee that. Yes, there is one, and it's law. Law is the only guarantee that we can have, even for state affairs. You were talking about presidential campaign accounts. It's probably only the last bastion, if you like, of democracy. Thank you very much, Frédérick, for reminding me of that point. Obviously, it's not a solution for everything, but it was just to remind you of that. No, but you're right. It is an essential tool, of course. Yes, it's essential and unavoidable. But if I come back to those presidential accounts, and the amounts that were used during Jacques Chirac and Édouard Balladur's campaigns, they had exceeded the threshold, and so there was a council that was supposed to control this, but they went against the law. What they did was illegal, but they weren't punished for it afterwards. So what should we do about this? That's the, $100 million question there. Yes, I think it's a question of a citizens' convention, if you like. It's a political point of view. And I think that the function that we mentioned in terms of surveillance, if we have a surveillance for those who are supposed to be organizing surveillance, that's one thing. We've got to find a framework. And at some levels, I don't know whether there isn't a form of general trust that we could have if we have a draw and choose the people who are going to be working on these councils. And we have, we said that we had trust in that council of wise men that we mentioned earlier on. But the question now is to say which representative bodies would enable us to guarantee that trust. Maybe a citizens' convention is a model maybe that we could use. There are lots of territories that in Occitania, for example, that are starting to use this approach so that they can work on democracy, and they're looking at sustainable development within their territory using that idea. So earlier on, a question came up. I think it was Geoffrey who asked it. He said, what should be made transparent that isn't already transparent? Well, it's a broad question, isn't it? And we had some answers that came off in all directions. So we're talking about taxes for companies in Europe, masks, the salaries for all civil servants, and then afterwards we were talking about additives in food as well, all of those E numbers that we see on our food. So should we be able to trace the health crisis? I saw somebody talking about the masks there. Maybe we could ask the people who are listening to us to tell us what they would have liked to have seen from public authorities. What could have been more transparent so that we could have better managed this crisis? Can we maybe come back to the beginning of the sanitary crisis, the health crisis? At what time did we start to hear information, share data, receive information that we gave to other citizens? And how did it start in terms of the transparency of information and the message? Should we have said everything right from the onset with the risk of creating panic? Or what should have happened, or what should happen? And is there anything that could characterize democratic public actions? How do you see this In terms of the first question at the beginning of the crisis, I like the fact that information was available, and because there was a map that was on the internet. It was created by a student in an American university who decided there wasn't enough information with regards to the number of cases throughout the world. And so that's something that we've seen throughout the COVID crisis. There were lots of times where public agencies or citizens couldn't find the type of way of representing data that they needed. And so they created the tools themselves. And we saw a lot of examples of this where people said, okay, we have this need, and then the solutions arrive. And then after that, it's the public actors that then take over and use that same information. However, the beginning of the crisis was a little bit like a race for information, and so many people wanted to know what the situation was with regards to the illness, with regards to access to masks, with regards to the information that was available. And there was a real race for information that was so important, and the governments were behind. They were lagging behind everyone else. And I think that that really was what happened during the first part of the crisis. And then after that, information started to become your uniform right up until lockdown. And then we started to have more requests coming in for different types of information. What do you mean, like other types of information? Well, once we're coming out of the crisis, people were talking about accountability. So once we've come through the crisis, people are saying, okay, we've managed to come through this. We have managed to come through the lockdown. And so now people want to have more information about whether leaders made the right decisions or not. And so that's when we're finding the questions like, how are we going to make people accountable for the decisions that they made? And so once we have got all of that information, how do you think, or what information do you think we need if we're going to be able to judge the quality of the decision that was made, or whether the decision was made at the right time? How can that work, Yoan? The question is to say, well, who decides? That's the first thing. When you ask that question is, who's going to decide? Are we saying that it's the elected members? Is it the administrative body that should react? And so that's quite complex, because depending on the scale, the information that's required will not be the same, because the responsibility isn't the same either. However, in a lot of areas where we have assessed the way in which the crisis was seen in lots of institutions, it was not very uniform, and we have seen lots of different dashboards which were requested at different levels so that we could see what the situation was, because that question of what's the situation now was very important. In some cases, there would be 3 or 4 dashboards that were coexisting at the same time and that didn't necessarily have the same objectives, uses, or the same credibility either. And at the end of the day, it requires a lot of expertise, and so those dashboards are put aside and people look more specifically at the information that is going to be put into PowerPoint form, because it's easier to understand. And so we've had so many discussions about the data that's got to be made available to make decisions, but when you look at the way in which that happened in the crisis, it wasn't really, decisions weren't really made based on all of this data. Just a question to Frédérick. You worked a lot on Chernobyl, and again, with regards to access to information and the management of information and transparency in terms of power, are there similarities or differences that you can see between the management of the crisis in the 1980s and the crisis that we're going through today? Oh, that's a huge question. Now, I wrote an article with regards to Chernobyl and COVID so that I could try and show that there were some very strange similarities between the two, for 2 catastrophic situations which would seem to be completely different. So one, a nuclear accident, the other, a pandemic. But first of all, in terms of the paradigm, they're quite comparable. In the 80s, It was the golden age of nuclear technologies. Nowadays, it's an energy which is in decline. We haven't built any more nuclear power stations since then. We've been trying to put one on stream over the last few years, but it's still not working. In the 80s, though, the state protected itself in a very violent way and tried to create a meteorological fiction with, and I'm sure you all remember what was said. And when you work on Chernobyl and you look at the collective memory of Chernobyl in France, people talk about lies. And you know that people at the time said that the nuclear cloud was coming, but the cloud stopped at the French border. And that's what people remember nowadays about that time, even though there are other traces of high contamination in the southeast and in Corsica still today. But at the end of the 80s, in the Chernobyl experience, civil society in France, which since 1968 had been working against the state and had been asking a lot of questions in the anti-Vietnam, anti-military movements. And so there was a liberal political movement amongst the youth, and Chernobyl enabled us to raise awareness with regards to the state. And if you compare to de Gaulle, when de Gaulle used to speak in public, it was the embodiment of France, and was France that had managed to make a comeback after the war, and it was the inheritance of the Fifth Republic. In 1986, we moved on to what we called the Society of Risk, and so there was civil society who defied the authorities and what they were saying, who were supposed to be competent in terms of risk management, but also in terms of the way in which they protected the interests of the state and industry. And so there was a real defiance, and we're still going through that situation today. So if you have a look at the Lubrizol accident, we're going to be starting a thesis on the way in which independent scientists have started working on that type of crisis. And because when the prefect said, oh, there's no problem, you can go back to sleep, you know, that's just we all know that there were dioxins in that factory at the time, but it was a mini Chernobyl, really. It was a huge accident, which is a repetition for me of what happened in Chernobyl and in Fukushima and in various other situations, catastrophic situations around the world. And the crisis, the COVID crisis, follows the same sort of rationale. Now, I'm trying to work on this at the moment. I'm writing for a review on human rights and some of the decisions that have been made. And the decision that was made for lockdown on a planetary level is something that had never been seen since 1945. I think since German occupation, we'd never seen this type of policy, this authoritarian decision to remove our fundamental liberties. It was something that had never happened before, and it's something that people didn't pay attention to, really, because we're talking about people's health, and health is sacred. And Foucault had said that in the 1970s, but it is imperative for us to make sure that everything, all of the rules are followed and all of the instructions are followed. And if we look at COVID, after the astonishment, because there was a moment of emptiness, there was a void where nobody wrote anything for a few days, and then Gambetta wrote a paper on the way in which we could consider that society was being taken over, and some intellectuals started to write as well to say that control had been taken away from the people. And then there was a saturation of the media where there was so much data. And that's something that happens quite frequently, because all of a sudden we come to a time where we saturate the capacity whereby people can understand what's going on, because there is so much information, so many different things being said. And today we find ourselves in that situation. And what bothers me about the way in which COVID has been managed, to come back to the question of information and transparency and access to data, the governing bodies hide behind an ad hoc committee where we ask people to say things, and when they don't say what we want them to, then we fire them. And at the end of the day, 2 or 3 weeks ago, 35 scientists signed a petition in the Parisien saying, let scientists do their job, because obviously it means that there will be lots of arguments, etc. And there is no united scientific community with regards to the challenges and the consequences of COVID. And so we need time, we need a space so that we can discuss this and so that we can compare ideas as we would in a democratic society. We need to do the same thing for science, because science needs this dynamic of being able to compare results, experiments, etc. Now, today, this discussion is forbidden because we've got an executive bodies who say we only want to hear one thing, and we only want to hear the people who are backing up the policies that we would like to implement. And so we've got to see what type of science we would like to would like to use, so that we can help us to manage this crisis. And there will be more and more crises, because that's what Pierre-Henri Brion is saying, because he's a professor of natural history, and he's one of the people who contested the way in which the pseudoscientific community has been working for the government, because he's saying we've got to prepare for other pandemics, we've got to prepare for climate change, and even worse, more serious problems than the problem that we're facing now, because COVID in 2020 represents 30,000 people who've died. So that's only more than the yearly flu. So we've got to think of the political response, which is an enigma that I'm trying to work on, because something is not right. Something hasn't been right from the onset. And again, I think that this type of crisis if we think about the 21st century, we're going to have more and more planetary challenges to deal with resources which are going to have to be huge. And if this is the way we're setting out, then it's going to be very difficult for democracy, and we're not preparing for a happy future in terms of the way in which we're going to live. I think we'll be looking at an Orwellian or a Wells situation rather than Rousseau. And so I think we've got to use this experience, which is currently happening in front of us. And so we've got to prepare for citizens so that we can make sure that we are not falling under a sanitary or a health dictatorship, because what I can see now is a controlled society. It's something we could have feared a few years ago, but today it's actually becoming reality with motives like health, protecting life. Now, I want us to protect life, but at what price? And what life are we talking about? And in the past, the scientists have said, I would rather die of COVID in a free country than under a health dictatorship. So what type of society do we want to live in? And I can imagine that this will make people react. So can we take some questions maybe from some of the people who are attending the roundtable? Are there any questions that people would like to ask at the moment?
And then there is a question that was asked earlier: what information should have been made public or transparent to manage a crisis? We had as answers the origin of the virus, the fact that we don't know much about the virus, maybe also a real-time development with progresses and decreases, also the number of face masks. Can we take questions?
Aucune question de personne sur le chat.
So no question on the chat.
Oui.
Maybe I can intervene here about making public. We have here the lack of understanding, lack of knowledge about the virus. I'm interested in saying that we don't know, we're not aware, and then we have to get information. But maybe we should talk about the right to doubts and the right to a lack of knowledge. And it's not synonymous to lack of skills. I'm not going to quote Socrates here, but it can be reassuring to say that we don't know from a sincerity point of view. So we don't know, but we'll try to understand. Instead of saying anything and everything, white and black, I think it's much more interesting to be sincere. I agree with you But what's the transparency of uncertainty? How can we show that from a political point of view?
Donc si on n'a pas de questions,
if we have no question, so either everything is very clear or very opaque.
on a une question.
Yes, we have one question.
L'action publique
Does the transparency of the public action find its limit in holding a public order, an established order, or should it be absolute? So the transparency of public action, does it find its limit in an established order, or should it be absolute, general? Frédérick, an answer to that? I think that's a question that we have already debated, that goes back to the notion of what is public. Is it a bureaucratic executive body that works as a company, cut from the rest of the world? Or is it in everyone's hands? Each citizen has a double belonging, a public life and a private life. Public life is a right. It has to be encouraged. That's the core democracy, to encourage the participation to public life. All that is really formal, of course. In the practice and in history, we have structures that protect themselves, but ideally, at the scale of territories, where we act, if we are designers or sociologists, we can do the same work and give rights to citizens through surveys, memory, whatever. We can engage categories of people. So that public involvement has to be encouraged. That can be the acceptance of a mandate, a remit as an elected representative, or be part of a non-profit association. And then private life is oikos, that's economics, Greek acceptance, that has to be shared by some limits. The right to private life is fundamental. Even if for sociological and psychological reasons, some people show off their life in the public domain, and that's the porosity between public and private lives. Elected representatives have to show their private life, to show their assets, and so on. I don't know if it's a democratical progress to ask an elected representative to know about their heritage, their assets, and so on. That's not our business. They are there for a temporary task, temporary remit, and to work for the benefit of the general interest. So if they have a Rolls Royce or a small car, that's not our business. Or at least that's not related to our question here. Now, should transparency be total? If we have a public understanding of the public, there is even no question. We should share in the public domain all that is part of the public field, how a town council works. Today, any citizen can demand for the minutes of the town councils, the meetings. Every public body that is part of democracy is accountable. According to me, the problem is the interdependency of the public and the private. When a group like Monsanto in the US works with people from the main agencies of the Food and Drug Administration or FAO and so on, and the other way around, when private people from Monsanto are taken as experts in those public agencies, then there is an issue there. And today we are in such a world where the main industrial interests are totally relayed, linked to the public sphere. And one of the main tasks should be to put everyone back at one's place and to put protections. And only the public power, unfortunately, can put these limits, and that leads me to ethics, and that's where I started. We live in a society of acceleration of flows, of data, of products, of electrons, of people, and these flows have to be monitored, and sometimes limits have to be put back. Same thing for COVID. It's a virus that gets disseminated, and our issue is to establish protections. And in democracy, it's just the same thing. What's at stake, one of the main tasks here, is to rethink that border between public and private fields. In the current understanding, because we're no longer in the 19th century or in antique Greece, we are in society of the internet. So we have to rethink that question with the current tools and means. We have another question, maybe it will be the last, and then we'll turn to our conclusion. How can design allow to make information transparent or realities? How can design intervene with transparency? Yoan or Geoffrey? Yeah, I can start. In the understanding of public services, we don't often ask about its review. There is an assessment, of course, but in the conception of public devices, we don't think a lot about how they are reviewed, questioned, amended, analyzed. And if we do, it's often for managerial tasks and not democratic ones. So what are the criteria that allow us in our century to follow the public services? We start having possibilities with the assessment of the cairn in public action, green budgets, and so on. There are some tax systems that are interesting, but they are restricted. When we have a phone service or a digital service that will allow people to interact with the civil service, how can we make sure that it is feasible, opposable, that it plays the role of some trust? Know that you can change mind, that you can have somebody in front of you. There is a role of designer in public action to bring these questions forward. I think there is a clear responsibility from the designer here. That brings me to a question, except if Geoffrey has something to add. Yeah, I agree with Yoan in terms of that role and that responsibility in the public field, but also in the private field. Most designers work in the private domain, and these ethic questions are very important. We often oppose designers to the fact that there are dark pattern surveillance systems due to them, and it's their fault. Of course, it's part of the responsibilities and the ingredients when a designer has to work with design, when they are asked to create interfaces, graphism, and so on. They will take into consideration technical, economic, conceptual issues of the project, but also social and ethical issues. And it's sometimes put aside, though it's linked to transparency. Should I lie to the user? Should I hide things from them? And Dieter Hams, in the big design principles, says a good design is an honest design, with many different issues linked to honesty. But according to him, the good design should not lie to the user. It has to be transparent. Dieter Hams was making objects, of course. So I'm not going to tell you about Papanek in design, but there are other contemporary designers as well, where there are plenty of criteria that are put online, and then there are aspects of private life in design, carbon, environmental impacts, social issues, inclusion issues that intervene, and also the transparency of information in design. And once again, that's part of a new component that we have in our brain when working with design. So we have to get trained to that, discuss with people like Frédérick, sociologists, researchers, different people, to add constraints in that design that we create. And I would invite the people who are listening to us, the designers, people who code, who work on interfaces, pictures, and so on. I would invite them to take position maybe and wonder how they take part in democracy when they unbalance the order or when they re-establish the balance between citizens and democratic elections. If they act for the social order or for an order that is clean, as Frédérick has said when talking about Monsanto and so on. Today we have plenty of French politicians who go and work for the private sector and then who come back to the public domain. So first they serve the state, then they serve companies, and then they come back to work for the state. And it's very dangerous because serving the state while having the company, the background of one's brain is never good. And we've seen that with a few scandals of the French political life. And in terms of what you've said, Geoffrey, on the role of design in the conceptions of different elements that we have in the digital industry or in everyday life, on democracy, can we say that design is a tool for democratic resilience? Same thing, it's a bit late to start defining the notion of resilience, and I see Frédérick smiling here. But indeed, in my work, we can wonder about resilience as an ingredient in the brain when I work on design. I mean, will I make things more resilient, more resistant to shocks on the environment and so on, that citizens have to bear with or not? I should have that resilience in mind when working as a designer. And then in what order we put the ingredients, that's how I try to define ethics to my students. If I have many ingredients, what do I put on top, second and third? That will define my ethics. Maybe it can change according to how mature I am, according to what the world is like. And that issue of resilience is for me empowering people for whom I work, handing over the keys of the knowledge, of my tools, of my know-how, so that people are more autonomous, more adult, stronger, the people I work with. So for me, it's a sincere tool. It's a way of dealing with design in a clear way, in order to give that to an NGO, a public structure, and then I can turn to other projects. I don't know if I've answered to your question, but I've tried to. It's anyway a good opportunity for the rest. Johan, would you like to conclude? And then I think that we're going to stop. I think that's a good end in a way. We have another question on the chat.
Alors, c'est la question des vérités bonnes à dire.
The truths are good to state or not? Are all truths good to be expressed, and are we ready to hear them? Maybe we can take that example. Are all truths good to be stated in public action? Should we have said that we had no face masks, but that they were useful? Or should we have said that face masks were not useful? I think that the question of masks is a bit like a Chernobyl cloud. When we talk about COVID in France, and you know, I have a lecture on the management of that crisis, and I try to untangle some hypotheses with my students. Obviously, the main speech, the main theories of people is that it's really stupid to have a mask on in a desert street. Any citizen, without making some higher epidemiological survey, can understand that. But at the same time, 1 hour later, people will get packed in a train and they will accept to take risks eating simply to have some space of freedom. So it's very complicated in terms of management of everyday and the benefit-risk balance, everyday life. We've been told in France that masks were useless because we had none, and now that we have millions of them, we have to use them. It's interesting to hear that and to wonder what it means. Is it a foundation or not? Democracy is the doxa. We're not going to ask each citizen to be an expert in epidemiology or others. We need to have an interpretation and to take the words, the speeches as revealing for a mindset, for a trust or a distrust. That's what we learn to do in sociology. There is no truth in what the other person reflects. Even in a survey, we only hear what other people want to tell us. I think that today there is an atmosphere of distrust that is pretty general, that is offset by fear. The more the media repeat that the situation is extremely serious with many dangers, people start believing it. And science should be able to demonstrate that, and it's not the case yet. But what's a problem is the way the information, and I've heard that we had saved thousands of deaths thanks to the lockdown. What I have from figures in different regions of France is that we are likely to have more victims of the lockdown than death due to the COVID in regions where not much was around. Then, is any truth good to be said? That question has to be put in context. And I'd like to mention a last example. In Chernobyl, I met an old woman who did not want to have a garden checked. That was everything she had to eat. She had some farming in a garden. And so either she's told that the garden is clean and that reduces her stress, so she knows that she can end her life with clean food, or she's told that her garden is contaminated, but anyway she has no other house or no other garden. So her interest was not to know. And when I worked with my colleague on the nuclear in the Nord Cotentin region, we met many people who said, we prefer not to know. We never read the local press. We don't get information because we don't want to hear bad news. So to lighten the stress, to have a bearable and acceptable life, these people preferred not to know. It's not simple, you see. That's extremely interesting. We're going to stop here. I think we'll have remembered that the issue of transparency is complex, multidimensional. What we try to get in terms of components to guarantee democracy by public action is access to information, to data, the possibility to handle the data, to understand it. I think that's what we will remember. Thank you. Thank you, the three of you, Frédérick, Yoan, Geoffrey. I'd like to thank as well the audience who've listened to us with a lot of attention. I wish you a good afternoon. Don't forget that policy conferences are also there tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. Enjoy your afternoon. Bye.